Thanks, Eric. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you again. Yes, really excited actually to be chatting with Cal here today. Have to say we are avid Slack addicts in 101 ways, and all of our clients, it's been all about Slack this last few years. It's been great. I have to say, I warned you about this anyway, but I did put out a shout to everyone in 101 ways when I knew that I was going to be chatting with you today, and said, is there anything specifically you would ask of Cal? And everybody wants to know, how come GIFs and emojis are like the core of communication for business these days, and how did you see that one coming? That's what we want to know, is what prediction did you have? But yes, come on, introduce yourself, let everyone know who you are, and please answer that for everyone 101 ways too.
That's a great opener. So I'm Cal Henderson. I'm one of the co-founders and the CTO at Slack. So I run our engineering organization, and I'm based in San Francisco. The reason we had kind of, emoji support from the beginning and custom emojis was really because I was a bit obsessed with emojis before they came to the kind of Western phones, back when it was just a thing in Japan. I was like, this picture language is, such a uniquely Japanese way of, conveying feelings with small amounts of text, right? It makes more sense coming from Japanese communication, which just because of the language is so different on on phones online. And I was so obsessed with it, and then it eventually came to the West and got really big. And I was really interested in it technically, but I think the reason that it's been successful and important at Slack, along with GIFs, is because that there was always this kind of weird juxtaposition of how people communicate in the workplace, right? If you read emails, and emails have been around for 40 years now, and they were the evolution basically of the interoffice memo. That's why we have like the subject line, and the routing information and carbon copies as a metaphor. And they're super formal. You start with the salutation, you kind of get to the point, and then you have this long footer, and, please don't print this, save the trees, whatever. And there's all this formal structure around it. But if you think about how you actually talk with your coworkers, the people who you communicate with every day when we were in offices, it's much more casual. You have a relationship with those people in some sense of the word relationship. You have a unique culture around how you communicate that might be different between different people, different teams, different offices. And I think emoji and animated GIFs are a way to be able to enshrine that culture of how you operate together in a digital medium. And so I think it's kind of inevitable that this kind of, it's not a consumerization of the enterprise, it's more of a relaxation of how formal work communications had been, to bring it closer to how you communicate in person and how people have been communicating kind of in their consumer lives for a long time. So I think it's that, as this whole kind of last couple of decades of movement of the whole idea of like bringing your whole self to work, and people identifying more with their companies and the things their companies are doing and aligning themselves with the goals of what they do at work, that I think it's kind of an inevitability that people want to express themselves more. And I think it's just a great medium for that.
I think it's awesome too. We can have a whole conversation just with emojis and reactions and GIFs, but yes, we do that all the time. So what we're actually talking about then is building an all-star team to scale, what I've learned. So tell us a bit about that journey. It must have been massive from where you started to where you are. What does that scaling look like then?
Yeah, when we started out before Slack trying to make a video game, and that we spent a few years on that, and that didn't work out. And then we started building Slack, and we started out with 8 people at the time when we started building. We're about 3,000 now, although we're part of Salesforce, which is an even larger company. And so there were periods where we were more than doubling in a year on the engineering side, with more than 1,000 engineers today. And I think probably the most challenging part of that is the kind of cultural aspect to it, about how you keep and evolve an identity of a team of people. I think there are, when you're building an organization, when you're building any kind of company, certainly any kind of product company, there are 3 things you build. And you start out, the first thing you build if you're a product company, is your product. And that's the thing, you iterate and find your product market fit, and maybe that doesn't work and it's the end of your company, or you pivot into something else. But that's the thing you think about kind of every day, is how do we build this product into something that people need, people will pay for, that could be a successful business. That's the second thing you build after that, is the business. How do we turn that thing that is useful, that there is some demand, into a business? How can we charge for it in such a way that it makes financial sense, that there's an outcome here that makes a sustainable or growing business? Sometimes people do that the other way around, right? They come up with a business and then make the product that fulfills those business needs. But the third thing everybody builds is a culture. And that happens whether you build it or not. It is an outcome of, culture is less a thing and more a practice. It's not what you say, it's what you do as you work together. It's how you work together as a team, what your kind of rituals are, what your kind of processes are, what you value, what you don't, what you reward and what you don't. And I think in some ways, that's the hardest thing to do, because it's the most nebulous. It's obvious what a product is and how you can measure that people want it. It's obvious what a business is, and there's a lot of kind of, laws and generally accepted accounting principles of how you measure if you have a business. And less so around culture. It's much more nebulous. It's much more like, you know it when you see it, right? And you have to experience it to understand it. And I think that when I look back on the early days of Slack, when it was 8 people, when it was 10, when it was 50, when it was 100, it is a very different place to work now. And some of that is necessary because of scale, because when you're a very small company, you operate very differently. You need a different set of skills. But also it's because things evolve and we're in a very different situation than we were a decade ago. How we work is different. How we relate to the world is different. The set of kind of products and services and how people work and how they operate is different as well. So I think in many ways, the hardest thing is, how do you evolve a culture as an organization grows to both, I think that there's failure scenarios on kind of either end of the spectrum of, if you continue to try and operate as a small company, as you get larger and as you're growing, that will not work. Because the way you think about work, the way you communicate, the way you hire, the way you operate as a business needs to change as you get larger, or it just falls apart. And on the other side, if you throw away everything, if you hire too quickly, and it's not really about hiring too quickly, but it's about understanding what parts of your culture and values you want to keep and what parts you want to evolve, then you also can become kind of unmoored, untethered, and you're lose the soul of your company, and it just you lose what you loved and what was special about it, and isn't necessarily a great place to work. So I think that ultimately you want to end up somewhere in the middle, which is your culture evolves, it is still recognizable as your organization, but it's changing to respond to those needs as you get bigger and bigger. And I think one of the things that we always tried to do with Slack from the very beginning is that I wanted it to be a place that I enjoyed working at, that was fun and rewarding and fulfilling to work at, whether we were 10 people or 100 people or 1,000 people.
Evolving the culture, as you say, it must change from the 8 to the however many hundreds you have now, however big you are. Yeah. But how purposeful were you in that? Because I think it's something I see in a lot of organizations that will come to us for help or for assistance or for an assessment or some view of, we need to try and shift our culture and we need to try and transform where we are. And it's like, okay, that's where we are. If you see it coming and you're purposely evolving your culture, how cognizant were you of that at the time? It's all very wise words now after you've grown it, but how purposeful were you as you were growing it?
I think it was something that we identified really early on, is we wanted to not just understand how we operated today, when we were small, but understand what it was that we wanted to keep. And so in our first year, we took the whole of the company, probably because it wasn't many people. We did like a 1 or 2 day offsite where we just talked about our values and what we wanted our core values to be as an organization. And that endured now through almost a decade. And that changed exactly how we put them into practice. But we decided what it was that was important to us that we wanted to keep as values. They'll have different value expressions as we get bigger. And I think that was helpful for us for identifying what it was we really cared about that we were doing and what it was that we just did because it made sense at the time. Now, definitely the practice of every role at every part of the company has evolved really significantly over time. And there are different inflection points as you scale. I think probably the biggest one that required the I don't know if it's the most intention, but it's definitely the biggest kind of step change, certainly from kind of product engineering side, is at the point when we got big enough where we couldn't know what everybody was doing all of the time. And I don't mean like in a Big Brother, like what buttons are you pressing kind of way, but in this is the feature that this person is working on this week, or this is the highest priority for that person. And that was probably around the kind of in the 30 to 50 range of employees, when we went from everybody having an ambient awareness of what everybody else was working on to, well, we'd better have teams now, and they should have some kind of defined mission, because not everybody can know what everybody's doing. And I think that's probably the most important tipping point on scaling as you grow a team, because after that you can just apply the same thing kind of fractally. And there are problems that come out of that as you have tens or hundreds of teams and aligning all of those. But the moving from that model that you always have if you're working alone or just with a couple of people, of we are all super aligned, everybody knows what everybody's doing, and we're moving in this one direction, to a world where you can have people who are not aligned at all, working at different, similar directions, but pulling in different directions. And that's where you can really slow down as an organization and get really caught up. But I think it's another interesting point is around as you hit those kind of milestones as an organization, what is the right point to bring in process, and what is the right point, or what is too much process? I think the engineers in general are kind of more on one end of the spectrum of not wanting to put process around things. I think that can be really dangerous as you're scaling. You need to figure out what are the things that as an organization we're not uniquely suited to do. I think this happens on the technology side, but certainly on the process side. On the technology side, if you're like making some kind of web SaaS service and you're a small team, you probably don't need to write your own database. You don't need to write your own operating system or your own web server. It is a lovely trap to get into as an engineer, to be like, I'm going to make everything. Google does everything. It's like, okay, but you don't have 50,000 engineers. You have 3. And so you concentrate on the things which are high leverage and the things which are going to be different about your organization, rather than the things which you can kind of get off the shelf. And I think the same applies for process. Like, how do you want to differentiate yourselves? Do you really want to like invent a new agile process for how you work together? Or do you want to like use something that's that other people have figured out and learned about? What's the thing that's going to differentiate you as an organization? That said, I think an even bigger danger as you're growing is not understanding when to throw process away. I think a lot of organizations that I see as they grow find it easy to adopt things and very hard to give them up, because that's the way we work. And I think as you're growing, almost any way that you work now or any way you're about to start working is going to have some kind of short shelf life. And if you're in the stage where you're doubling every year, more or less everything you do now is not going to work a year from now. But I think organizations in general find it much harder to throw things away than they do bolt more things on. So as a result, you just end up with more and more processes, and you get into this kind of very familiar organizational gridlock of you spend all of your time doing the work around work, or hyper-realistic work-like activities rather than actual work. And I think it's finding that right balance. I think one of the challenge there as a leader in a really growing organization is really always making sure that you are looking up far enough. When you're very small, very early, you don't have to look very far ahead. It's like, we need to get product market fit, we need to launch this thing, or we're going to run out of runway to be able to keep paying people, right? And it's maybe your view is on the next day or the next week or maybe the next month. But making sure you raise that kind of view and that timeline as you're growing, to be like, okay, we're going to be able to make payroll for the next year. So where do we want to be in 6 months? And where do we want to be then in 12 months? And then as you grow, that timeline looks bigger and bigger until you're getting into the several years. But it needs to happen slowly. You need to think, what are the things that I need to get in place now? And that might be from hiring or process, or often hiring process, to get us in place there. And I think, we barely talked about hiring, even though this session's kind of about hiring, I guess. But I think that's one of the kind of natural constraints that's placed on organizational evolution, is that hiring people is a slow process. And depending on the country you're in, can be really slow. In the US, it's pretty fast because people don't give notice. In other countries, that can be pretty slow. And that puts kind of like a natural kind of a natural break on organizational growth, and you need to be planning out in chunks far ahead enough that you can understand, if I put all of this time into hiring right now, this is the point I can be in 6 months or 12 months.
So just as a time check as well, so we only have about 5 minutes left of the session before you're going to go into coffee break. They're a really short session. We could talk for hours, I'm sure. If anybody does have any questions that you particularly want to pose to Cal, obviously you can talk more than just gifs and emojis. But yeah, pop them in the Q&A, and I'm happy to chat about those as well. Just while people are doing that, I wanted to draw back everything you described there. Sounds really familiar and very total common sense. I think the way that you described it before, when we were taking notes and stuff before this call, was kind of applying that iterative product mindset to the same way that you build then your team and the organization, which is kind of what you've been talking about that there. How far would you go then? Is that kind of sum up the way that you were talking just then?
I think that's probably true, and I think that there's a tendency for engineers, people from an engineering background, to like over-engineer everything. We see that, we have a term for this with like architecture astronauts, right? With the engineering side of building things. And I think that there can be that tendency in kind of any kind of process as well. How we operate, how work gets planned, how work gets executed, how you do hiring, how you do organizational planning. But I think there's also that's probably a pretty good outcome. I think one of the outcomes I often see with engineers is the opposite of like only code matters and only the product matters and everything else, like whatever, that's a thing for HR. I think you are not going to have a successfully growing organization if that's the way you think about things. I think one of the biggest things you can do, I'd say there are like two big things you should do as an organization that's growing. The first is think a lot about alignment and how you can make sure that everybody in your organization, as it's growing, as you're bringing new people on, as work gets more complex, that everybody knows what matters and what direction you're going in, and and vaguely how you're going to get there. And that alignment, that plan gets more complex and more detailed over time, but making sure everybody understands where you're running. Because if everybody knows where you're going to, then you can give people a lot more autonomy. Right? If you know the challenges that you're trying to get people to solve, then you can let people figure out their own solutions to it, because you know you're all going to end up in the same place if people solve those challenges. The second thing I'd say is recruiting and all of the parts of that, like sourcing, especially interviewing, even the offer process, make it repeatable as soon as possible, because it's a thing you don't want to have to artisanally figure that out for every individual person you talk to. You want to figure out how you can make that repeatable, and that also means how you can make it fair. And then also, if you can make it repeatable, you can scale it as well. I've hired thousands of engineers at Slack alone, and the way in which that was possible was by making sure we had kind of every year, every 6 months, more and more people who could be part of that process, who could be interviewers, who could be hiring managers, and that we were able to make a consistent process and consistent decisions. And some of that was just like writing it down. It's like, this is how we interview, this is what we want to ask, and this is what we expect to hear, and this is how we will assess people, and refine that over time and make sure it's a constant feedback cycle, and think about that like product iteration. Like, what we do first isn't going to be very good, because it's going to be the kind of MVP, but also our needs are going to change. Just like the needs of the product that we built 10 years ago is not the same product that we're building today, because we have a different audience, because there are different needs, the industry has moved on, whatever it is. So putting process around that, allowing it to be repeatable, allowing it to be scalable is what's going to matter. Because while I interviewed many hundreds of engineers in the first few years, I can't interview everybody as much as I would like to. I can't make every hiring decision. That would be silly. I want to be able to scale that, and I want to make sure that it's consistent as well.
Cool. There is a question just come over, I see on the screen, from Sharon, saying, do you have an example of throwing a process away?
So since we're talking just about hiring, one that we did early on is that before each candidate who came on site, back when we had offices, for an interview, we would get all of the interviewers together and do what we called at the time a pre-round table, to talk about who the candidate was, what people were going to talk about, how this interview process was going to go. We needed to do that at the time when we instituted that process, to align people on what the role was, why we were hiring, what the background of the candidate was, and realized after a while, like, don't really need to do that after we've hired a lot of people, because we should know what the role is, because we should have listed it well, and we know what team it's going to join. They're going to join, and we know what every interview slot is, because we've defined what the 4 interviewers are going to talk about. So this isn't actually useful. It's just a waste of everybody's time, and we should all know what it is going into this. So let's get rid of that. But it felt like at the time, well, that's part of how we interview, and that's our process. But every bit of process is just something we made up. Like, we can make it up and give it away just the same. It's not necessarily a great example, but it's certainly something that we had as a process for a long time. And one day we're like, that's not actually that useful anymore. We shouldn't build on top of this. We should throw away and start over.
The principle's there, though, isn't it? It's about questioning the value of it. If it's not serving you anymore, if it's not valuable, then yes. I think the principle's right.
Like anything, it's a bit of a balance, because you don't want to be the person that questions everything you do every day, or you eventually just go mad. But stepping back at everything you do, it's all, we are tricking sand into thinking, right? As a job, we've made everything up. Computer science is entirely made up. And we can step back at any point and think about anything we do and whether it's the right thing for us right now as an organization.
No, we're actually out of time, and I can't believe that 20 minutes went so fast. So any final thoughts just as we close out then, Cal?
I think going back to what I said earlier, you build 3 things when you're building a business over the long term. You build the product, you build the business, and you build the culture. And the culture is the one that will happen regardless of whether you think about it or whether you put intention into it, and is in some ways the most important one that's going to make the difference of whether it is enjoyable and rewarding to work somewhere. So, and not every organization is going to have the same culture, the same values. Think about how you feel about your organization, what you want to be true about it a year from now, 5 years from now, and make sure that you're on the path to do that with the culture that you're building.